Have you ever wondered what happens when burning passion crosses the line into pure chaos? Welcome back. Today, we dive into a legendary night in El Paso, Texas, where the blinding lights of stardom met the absolute frenzy of devoted fans. What really went wrong when thousands gathered? How did a beautiful celebration of music suddenly turn into a wild spectacle of questionable choices? Was it just overwhelming love, or a total lack of control? Are you ready to uncover the untold reality? Number 7. The Desert Stampede, Complete Madness. Picture this, the relentless, scorching sun of El Paso, Texas, beating down heavily on a sprawling sea of exhausted yet fiercely determined faces. We are talking about a punishing desert heat that doesn't just warm your skin, it bakes you to your very core, an unforgiving, arid environment where basic survival requires constant hydration and vital shade, not cramped, flimsy camping tents and severe sleep deprivation on unforgiving concrete sidewalks. El Paso, with its breathtaking desert landscapes and rugged mountains, is a city of immense natural beauty, but it is certainly not built for the sudden, chaotic influx of tens of thousands of hyper-fixated fans camping out for days on end. Yet, nearly a full week before the venue doors were even scheduled to crack open, a massive, makeshift city of loyal supporters had already claimed the surrounding area, creating a bizarre ecosystem entirely fueled by intense anticipation and nervous, vibrating energy. This wasn't just a simple concert queue, it was a staggering testament to human dedication, a physical manifestation of deep love for the global phenomenon that is BTS. But right here is the burning, highly uncomfortable question we absolutely must confront: at what exact point does unyielding dedication morph into a reckless, terrifying disregard for personal safety, collective sanity, and basic human decency? The atmosphere was unimaginably thick, not just with the sweltering Texas humidity and blowing desert dust, but with a palpable, almost suffocating anxiety that hung heavy in the air like a dark storm cloud about to burst. Everyone wanted to be first. Everyone desperately wanted that elusive, highly coveted barricade spot, the once-in-a-lifetime chance to lock eyes with the beloved leader, RM Kim Namjoon, the towering pillar of the group, the men whose deeply philosophical lyricism and commanding, yet incredibly comforting stage presence have inspired millions around the globe to speak their truth and truly love themselves, was safely inside the cool, air-conditioned arena, meticulously preparing to give his absolute all for the fans. Outside, however, in the brutal, unrelenting heat, the very core message of self-love and mutual respect he so passionately championed was about to be violently trampled into the dusty El Paso ground. As the beleaguered, overwhelmed security staff finally signaled the opening of the first outer checkpoint, a terrifying, seismic shift instantly occurred within the complex crowd dynamics. The unspoken, delicate rules of the queue, that fragile, invisible social contract that had remarkably held thousands of highly emotional people in a relatively orderly fashion for days, shattered into a million pieces in a single, heart-stopping instant. A sudden, massive surge originating from the very back of the mile-long line sent a violent, unstoppable shockwave rippling through the dense crowd. It wasn't just a gentle push or an accidental bump, it was a relentless, terrifying tidal wave of human bodies acting purely on raw, unfiltered adrenaline and a blinding, desperate fear of missing out. Heavy barricades made of solid steel groaned agonizingly and actually buckled under the immense, crushing physical pressure of thousands pushing forward simultaneously. People who had been sitting and sharing snacks peacefully just moments before were suddenly fighting for actual breathing room, their feet literally lifted off the ground as the unstoppable human crush propelled them forward entirely against their will. The sheer terror, the wide-eyed panic in the eyes of those desperately caught in the middle of this suffocating vortex is something that will forever haunt the memories of the El Paso venue staff and the heroic local paramedics who were frantically forced to rush to the chaotic scene. This wasn't just an embarrassing moment to look back on and cringe at on social media, it was a genuinely terrifying display of primal mob mentality completely taking the wheel, entirely overriding logic, basic empathy, and crucial safety protocols. Inside the massive venue, amidst the incredibly loud, thumping bass and precise choreography run-throughs of the soundcheck preparations, word quickly reached RM about the spiraling, highly dangerous chaos unfolding just beyond the arena walls. Imagine, for a painful second, the crushing, suffocating weight of that realization for a leader whose absolute core message to the world is empathy, healing, and personal self-care. RM is widely revered and deeply respected for his sharp intellect and profound care for the army, often taking to live streams or writing beautifully extensive, poetic letters urging his fans to find their own happiness, to study hard, to respect others, and most importantly, to stay safe. To hear the disturbing news that the very people he considers his precious extended family, his massive global support system, were aggressively pushing, shoving, and literally trampling over one another just to get a few feet closer to him must have been a profoundly jarring, deeply confusing, and utterly heart-wrenching experience. Witnesses and staff backstage noted a visible, undeniable shift in Namjoon's usually steadfast and calm demeanor, a heavy, exasperated sigh, a momentary, defeated drop of those broad, confident shoulders that usually carry the weight of the group so effortlessly. It perfectly and tragically encapsulates the agonizing paradox of immense, unprecedented global fame. Your art, your sincere words, and your music possess the divine power to bring diverse people together in perfect harmony, yet the deeply unhealthy obsession with your physical proximity can instantly tear their basic humanity and compassion apart. How can one authentically preach peace and mindfulness from a global stage when their mere presence in a city inadvertently incites a terrifying, localized riot? The El Paso queuing incident serves as a brutal, unforgiving mirror reflecting the darker, rarely discussed, and highly toxic side of extreme idol worship and parasocial relationships. We absolutely must ask ourselves, as active consumers of this vibrant culture, when we are screaming our lungs out for Namjoon, are we truly, genuinely listening to a single, meaningful word he says? From the prestigious podium of the United Nations to the incredibly intimate lyrics of Persona, he constantly begs us to be mindful, to be kind, to be a beacon of light and rationality in a dark, chaotic world. Yet, in that frantic, animalistic scramble in the burning Texas heat, human empathy was callously discarded like an empty, crushed water bottle on the hot pavement. People literally tripped over fallen fans, stepping on personal bags and even limbs without a single second glance, ruthlessly prioritizing a slightly better view of the concert stage over the physical and mental well-being of a fellow human being. This is precisely where the educational, deeply reflective core of our journey today truly lies. Fandom culture is undeniably a beautiful, powerful, world-changing force that can raise millions of dollars for global charity in a single day and create loving, supportive families across international borders, but it undoubtedly possesses a razor-thin, highly dangerous edge that can quickly cut extremely deep if it is not handled with immense self-awareness, emotional maturity, and constant, vigilant self-regulation. The queuing chaos in El Paso wasn't just a simple logistical failure of event management or a mere lack of security guards, it was a catastrophic, heartbreaking failure of community and shared values. It loudly begs the challenging, deeply uncomfortable question that many refuse to answer: do we secretly love the selfish idea of possessing a fleeting moment with our idols far more than we respect the actual idols themselves and the supportive community they painstakingly built for us? As the harsh El Paso sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long, dramatic, and melancholic shadows over the scattered, depressing remnants of broken lawn chairs, discarded fan signs, and trampled banners, the grim, sobering reality of the situation fully set in. Medical tents were completely overflowing with highly preventable cases of severe heat exhaustion, hyperventilation, massive panic attacks, and minor crush injuries. Number 6. The merchandise mayhem, savage scrambles, total greed. Stepping away from the agonizing, sun-baked nightmare of the outdoor barricade queue, our journey into the dark heart of the El Paso concert chaos takes us directly into the blindingly bright, fluorescently lit belly of the massive arena, where a completely different, yet equally disturbing breed of sheer madness was rapidly unfolding. You finally made it inside, your ticket is successfully scanned, the heavenly, freezing blast of the stadium's industrial air conditioning washes over your sweaty, exhausted body, and for a fleeting, beautiful fraction of a second, you foolishly think the absolute worst of the ordeal is finally over. However, the reality of the situation was far more sinister and deeply embarrassing. The official tour merchandise stands, usually a place of joyous, communal souvenir hunting and excited chatter were instantly transformed into brutal, unforgiving battlegrounds reminiscent of a chaotic, dystopian survival movie. Minimum wage venue workers, local El Paso residents who had simply signed up for what they innocently assumed would be a standard, relatively busy retail shift selling t-shirts and light sticks, suddenly found themselves staring wide-eyed and genuinely terrified into the ravenous, bloodshot eyes of thousands of hyper-fixated fans suffering from an extreme, highly toxic case of FOMO, the agonizing fear of missing out. It wasn't just a long, eager line. It was a savage, frantic scramble characterized by snatching premium photo cards right out of other people's unsuspecting hands, aggressively screaming horrific profanities at terrified, overwhelmed cashiers simply because the exclusive, limited edition El Paso Tour zip-up hoodie in size medium completely sold out in exactly 4.5 minutes, and literally throwing sharp elbows just to aggressively secure an illegal, cutting spot in a secondary, completely unofficial mob. This incredibly ugly scene brings us to a massively important, deeply uncomfortable psychological crossroad in modern fandom culture that we desperately need to talk about. When exactly did our profound, genuine love for life-saving music and incredibly inspiring artists become so inextricably, violently linked to rampant, uncontrollable consumerism and materialistic greed? Is your deep, personal, spiritual connection to the music somehow suddenly invalidated or deemed fake if you aren't physically wearing a $60, officially licensed tour t-shirt or carrying the latest version of the official lightstick? Think about the profound, heavy irony echoing through the massive concrete halls. The very music that brought everyone to this remote Texas desert city in the first place constantly, passionately speaks of shedding harsh societal expectations, of outright rejecting the cruel, materialistic rat race of the modern world, and finding true, unadulterated value within your own soul, your own words, and your own kind actions. Yet, in the blinding, chaotic glare of the merchandise concourse, that beautiful, profound message was completely, tragically lost in translation, entirely overshadowed by an ugly, rabid desperation to simply consume and possess a physical, expensive token of the event just to loudly flaunt on social media later that night. We sadly live in an era where the digital perception of your fandom, the perfectly aesthetic pictures of your massive concert hall, the highly curated, perfectly filtered videos of your premium VIP view, has somehow toxically superseded the actual, lived, human experience of simply being fully present in the moment, closing your eyes, and letting the live music heal you. The El Paso merch stand disaster was the absolute, undeniable physical embodiment of this modern digital disease. People weren't buying these items to quietly cherish them, they were violently fighting tooth and nail for them to loudly prove their ultimate devotion, engaging in a silent, utterly ridiculous, and highly toxic competition of who is the bigger, richer, more dedicated fan. This toxic hierarchy completely destroys the foundational, egalitarian beauty of a global fandom where everyone, regardless of their personal financial status or their ability to buy an insanely expensive VIP soundcheck package, is supposed to be completely equal, united under the beautiful, healing banner of music. And what about the immense, unseen psychological toll inflicted on the hard-working, vastly underpaid venue staff? The local El Paso workers, many of whom were just struggling college students trying to pay their hefty tuition bills or exhausted parents working a grueling second job to feed their families, were unjustly subjected to hours of unprecedented, concentrated verbal abuse, frantic, ear-piercing screaming, and actual physical pushing from a massive demographic that supposedly, loudly champions mental health awareness and universal kindness on the internet every single day. The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of the situation is enough to give anyone severe emotional whiplash. One venue security guard, visibly shaking, pale, and practically in tears after their exhausting shift ended, was later quoted saying they had previously worked massive, notoriously rowdy heavy metal festivals and aggressively violent sporting events in the past, but had never, ever in their entire career experienced the sheer, unyielding, terrifying intensity and profound lack of basic manners of this specific pop culture crowd. That is absolutely not a badge of honor for the fandom. That is a massive, glowing, neon red flag that urgently demands our immediate, deep introspection and a radical change in our collective behavior. In one particularly horrific, highly circulated incident that shocking day, a beautifully arranged, towering glass display of premium tour merchandise was actually violently pushed over by the surging crowd, shattering into thousands of dangerous, razor-sharp shards across the polished stadium concourse floor, simply because a massive, unyielding group of frantic fans simultaneously lunged for the very last remaining tour-exclusive bucket hat resting on top. The horrifying, deafening sound of shattering glass echoing loudly through the massive hall should have been an immediate, sobering wake-up call, a sharp, auditory stop sign to the collective madness, but tragically and incredibly, some overly obsessed individuals actually tried to crawl directly over the highly dangerous, jagged debris on their hands and knees just to desperately grab the fallen items before the panicked security guards could safely intervene. Fandom is supposed to be your ultimate, safe sanctuary, a joyful, shared escape from the crushing, exhausting pressures of daily reality, not a high-stress, cutthroat retail war zone where basic human decency is cheaply traded for a piece of exclusive tour merch. But if you truly think the chaotic, embarrassing desperation of the merchandise lines was the absolute peak of the El Paso disaster, you are drastically, hopelessly underestimating the escalating, uncontrollable, and deeply toxic energy of that fateful night. The physical injuries from shattered glass and trampled feet were merely the horrifying, chaotic warm-up act. As the venue lights finally, dramatically dimmed to a pitch-black darkness, and the deafening, earth-shattering roar of 50,000 screaming voices violently shook the very concrete foundations of the Texas stadium, the toxic, boundary-crossing behavior didn't miraculously stop, it simply migrated into the darkness, moving ominously and dangerously closer and closer to the stage itself. What exactly happens when the desperate, blinding need to be perceived by your idols completely overrides the fundamental respect for personal physical boundaries, and the very concept of a basic, concert etiquette, is thrown violently out the window? You won't want to look away for a single second as we dive headfirst into the next, deeply unsettling and highly controversial chapter of this unprecedented concert disaster. Number 5. The flying projectiles, airspace invasion, dangerous desperation. As the deafening, earth-shattering roar of the El Paso Stadium reached an absolute, dizzying fever pitch and the heavily anticipated concert finally transitioned from the highly choreographed, explosive opening numbers into the much more intimate, casually interactive segments of the monumental show, a deeply disturbing and physically dangerous new trend violently reared its ugly head, transforming the sacred, elevated performance space into a highly unpredictable, genuinely hazardous war zone. You see, there is an incredibly fragile, largely invisible but fundamentally essential barrier that exists between the elevated concert stage and the dense, pulsating general admission floor below, a crucial, unspoken boundary of mutual respect and basic human decency that allows the performers to execute their physically demanding, highly intricate choreography with absolute safety, artistic freedom, and vital peace of mind. But on this completely unforgettable, intensely chaotic night in the sweltering Texas desert, that vital barrier was entirely disregarded, completely and violently shattered by a relentless barrage of airborne projectiles launched by fans suffering from a blinding, terrifyingly selfish desperation to be noticed at any cost. It started somewhat innocently, or at least that is the incredibly false, highly manipulative narrative that people desperately try to spin online to justify their reckless, embarrassing actions. A small, soft plushie tossed gently onto the extended stage runway, a beautifully folded paper letter lightly fluttering like a wounded bird towards the massive monitor speakers. However, mob mentality is a horrifyingly rapid, highly infectious disease, and within mere minutes, the fundamental nature of these thrown objects escalated drastically from soft, well-meaning tokens of affection to genuinely dangerous, heavy projectiles that could easily cause severe, career-ending physical trauma. We are talking about half-full, hard plastic water bottles hurtling through the air, solid metal custom keychains, tightly rolled thick vinyl banners wrapped in heavy layers of duct tape, and, most shockingly, most absurdly of all, extremely heavy, $1,000 smartphones hurled aggressively through the stadium air with the sheer, terrifying force of a professional baseball pitcher winding up for a strike. The deeply toxic, incredibly alarming underlying motivation behind this unprecedented airborne assault is a twisted, modern psychological phenomenon born entirely from the toxic side of the digital age, the desperate, burning, all-consuming desire for a viral, perfectly framed, highly exclusive Y/N or your name moment. Fans were literally throwing their heavy, expensive devices directly at the performers, praying with a disturbing, mind-boggling level of pure entitlement that one of the beloved artists would miraculously catch the heavy phone mid-air like an action hero, quickly record a highly exclusive, beautifully personalized selfie video, and safely hand it back, instantly granting the aggressive fan massive, overnight internet fame and the ultimate, highly coveted bragging rights on every single social media platform. But let us hit the pause button right here for a profound, deeply uncomfortable moment of intense reflection and inject a massive, sobering dose of stark reality into this incredibly warped, dangerous fantasy. These globally beloved artists, the very beautiful human beings these fans loudly claim to adore, deeply respect, and fiercely protect with their entire existence, are up on that elevated stage working incredibly hard, sweating profusely under blinding, massive, multi-million-dollar lighting rigs, executing incredibly fast-paced, physically exhausting dance routines that require absolute, undivided spatial awareness, immense stamina, and razor-sharp mental focus. Suddenly having a heavy, solid brick of metal and shattered glass hurtling violently toward their faces, their precious vocal cords, or their rapidly moving, highly insured feet from the pitch-black abyss of the screaming crowd is absolutely not a cute, romantic, or memorable interaction. It is a terrifying, highly dangerous physical assault that borders on genuine criminality. The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of this collective behavior is easily enough to make any rational person's blood completely boil over. How can you genuinely, honestly claim to deeply love and fiercely protect an artist from the cruelties of the music industry, constantly trending massive global hashtags about their mental health, their need for rest, and their physical well-being, only to willingly, selfishly, and aggressively hurl a heavy object directly at their head the very precise moment you are finally standing a mere 10 feet away from them, all just to selfishly secure a fleeting, 5-second video for your own personal digital clout. During this specific, heart-stopping segment in El Paso, the situation on the floor became so intensely dangerous and utterly unpredictable that the performers had to visibly, noticeably alter their intricate stage movements, constantly darting their wide eyes nervously towards the barricade, instinctively flinching and dodging flying debris instead of freely, joyfully, and safely interacting with the massive audience like they usually love to do. The incredible, carefully curated, pure magic of the live performance, the beautiful, raw, unfiltered exchange of emotional energy between the passionate artist and the loving crowd, was abruptly, violently shattered, rapidly replaced by a tense, highly uncomfortable, and deeply suffocating atmosphere of genuine apprehension and fear. Venue security guards, who were already utterly exhausted, severely dehydrated, and physically battered from managing the earlier terrifying barricade stampedes and the horrific, glass-shattering merchandise scrambles we discussed earlier, were now desperately shining bright, blinding flashlights into the pitch-black, roaring crowd, frantically trying to spot the specific instigators and permanently stop the relentless barrage of items, but the sheer, overwhelming volume of flying objects coming from every single direction made it an absolutely impossible, hopelessly losing battle. The sheer, unprecedented disrespect shown directly to the artists, to the incredibly hard-working, unseen stage crew who had to constantly, dangerously scurry across the dark, slippery stage to frantically clear the hazardous debris before someone slipped, and to the surrounding innocent fans who were forcefully hit directly in the back of the head by heavy objects falling drastically short of the stage, is a profound, incredibly embarrassing, and permanent stain on the collective reputation of the fandom. This is exactly where the vital, educational, and critically reflective purpose of this documentary-style breakdown becomes absolutely essential for our community's future survival and growth. We must actively, aggressively, and collectively dismantle the deeply toxic, highly dangerous normalization of throwing absolutely anything onto a live performance stage. It simply does not matter if it is a soft, adorable teddy bear, a beautiful, expensive bouquet of flowers, or a ridiculously overpriced smartphone. The concert stage is a professional, highly active workplace, a physically demanding, tightly controlled environment, not a chaotic, free-for-all, deeply disrespectful carnival target practice game. When a beloved artist tragically slips on a carelessly discarded banner, completely rolling their ankle, or gets struck directly in the fragile eye by a poorly aimed, heavy, customized gift, the entire multi-million-dollar global tour can be instantly, permanently compromised, and the very person you supposedly adore is tragically subjected to unnecessary, entirely preventable physical pain, immense stress, and potential long-term, career-threatening injury, all because of your fleeting, unbelievably selfish greed for their momentary, forced attention. As the El Paso concert agonizingly marched on under this localized, highly embarrassing meteor shower of disrespect, the palpable, heavy, and profound disappointment radiating directly from the stage became undeniably, painfully obvious to anyone who was truly, genuinely paying attention to the artist's body language. Number 4. The barricade breach, desperate grabs, absolute disrespect. As the incredibly intense, emotionally charged El Paso concert slowly transitioned into its highly anticipated, deeply sentimental encore segment, a completely new, vastly more terrifying level of sheer entitlement and absolute disrespect violently erupted from the very front rows of the VIP standing pit. You see, the encore is traditionally meant to be a beautiful, highly intimate, and emotionally vulnerable moment. The heavy, synchronized choreography finally stops, the blinding stage lights soften to a warm, comforting glow, and the exhausted but incredibly grateful artist slowly walk down the narrow extended stage to personally thank the thousands of screaming fans, making genuine eye contact, bowing deeply, and sharing soft, unscripted moments of pure, unadulterated joy. It is supposed to be the magical, heartwarming pinnacle of the entire live music experience, the exact moment where the massive, intimidating global superstars are suddenly stripped down to just being beautiful, ordinary human beings connecting with their dedicated supporters. But on this dark, highly embarrassing night in the sweltering Texas desert arena, that beautiful, fragile bridge of mutual trust was not just metaphorically broken, it was violently, physically assaulted by a blinding, terrifyingly selfish wave of sheer, uncontrollable mob mentality. As the performers bravely ventured closer to the extreme edge of the stage, leaning down slightly with bright, trusting smiles to wave directly at the front row, a horrifying, synchronized surge of crushing human pressure violently pushed the dense crowd forward, completely ignoring the desperate, frantic screams of the venue security guards. But the absolute nightmare didn't simply stop at dangerous pushing, it rapidly escalated into a direct, shocking violation of fundamental bodily autonomy that left the entire stadium crew completely paralyzed with genuine horror. Several overly obsessed, wildly out-of-control fans, acting purely on a deeply toxic, adrenaline-fueled delusion of ownership, aggressively attempted to physically vault their bodies over the heavy steel barricades, violently thrusting their hands forward in a desperate, animalistic frenzy to physically grab, pull, and snatch at the passing artists. We are not talking about a gentle, accidental brush of hands during a high five. We are talking about aggressive, terrifyingly forceful grabs aimed directly at the performers' expensive stage outfits, their bare arms, and even, horrifyingly enough, their hair. Imagine, for just a single, sobering second, the sheer, paralyzing terror of experiencing that exact situation from the artist's highly vulnerable perspective. You are physically exhausted after performing high-intensity routines for 3 straight hours. You step forward with an open, trusting heart to simply say thank you to the people who loudly claim to love you the most, and instead of receiving smiles and positive energy, you are suddenly met with a terrifying sea of wildly flailing limbs, aggressive claws, and distorted, screaming faces desperately trying to rip a literal piece of you away like a souvenir. The sheer, staggering audacity, the profound, mind-boggling lack of basic human decency required to aggressively grab a complete stranger without their explicit, enthusiastic consent is a monumental, highly disturbing failure of basic societal etiquette, yet in the incredibly warped, highly toxic bubble of extreme fandom culture, this literal physical assault is somehow completely rationalized, sickeningly justified, and even proudly romanticized as an ultimate display of passion or dedication. This brings us to a massive, highly uncomfortable, and absolutely crucial educational reality check that desperately needs to be permanently tattooed onto the collective consciousness of every single concert-goer worldwide. Purchasing a highly expensive VIP ticket, waiting in a brutal, exhausting queue for an entire week, or streaming a music video 1,000,000 times online absolutely never, under any circumstances whatsoever, buys you the fundamental right to touch another human being without their clear permission. Your profound, deep-seated emotional connection to their beautiful art completely ends precisely where their physical, bodily autonomy begins. The horrifying barricade breach in El Paso forces us to harshly confront the incredibly dark, deeply toxic underbelly of extreme parasocial relationships, a terrifying psychological state where the fan entirely loses their firm grip on reality, completely forgetting that the globally famous idol standing right in front of them is not a highly advanced, interactive holographic toy designed solely for their personal entertainment, nor a beautiful, inanimate marble statue placed there to be touched, but a living, breathing, highly sensitive human being with a deeply inherent, non-negotiable right to personal space and basic physical safety. During this agonizing, chaotic ordeal, the highly trained security personnel, already stretched dangerously thin by the previous merchandise riots and the relentless, dangerous barrage of flying objects, had to literally physically peel aggressive, screaming fans off the heavy steel barricades, forcefully prying their white-knuckled fingers away from the very edge of the stage in a desperate, frantic bid to prevent a full-scale, highly dangerous stage invasion. The palpable, heavy atmosphere in that specific section of the arena instantly shifted from a state of euphoric, collective joy to one of sheer, unadulterated panic, deep confusion, and profound, lingering trauma. The artists themselves, visibly shaken, deeply shocked, and noticeably uncomfortable, were forced to abruptly, instinctively recoil, taking several massive, highly defensive steps backward away from the very people they had so eagerly come down to beautifully interact with just moments before. Their bright, trusting smiles were instantly, tragically replaced by wide-eyed, genuine apprehension, a deeply heartbreaking, highly visible betrayal of the sacred artist-fan trust that forms the very foundation of live music. The El Paso concert, up to this chaotic point, had already been a grueling, highly embarrassing marathon of logistical nightmares and bad behavior, but this specific, terrifying incident crossed a massive, glowing red line from mere chaotic annoyance directly into the highly disturbing realm of physical danger and potential legal assault. We absolutely must use this deeply unsettling, highly embarrassing moment not just to point fingers, but to fundamentally and aggressively rebuild the crucial, non-negotiable boundaries of our entire community. When exactly did we collectively normalize treating human beings like exclusive, limited edition merchandise that can be violently grabbed and possessed? It is completely, totally unacceptable, and if you genuinely, truly love these artists, you will actively, fiercely police this toxic behavior within your own circles, loudly calling out anyone who dares to cross that vital physical line. You must protect their peace, protect their bodies, and protect their fundamental right to feel completely safe while performing their art. The severe, lingering trauma of this physical breach undoubtedly left a deep, unseen scar on the overall trust between the performers and the massive crowd, permanently altering the dynamic of the remaining tour dates. But incredibly, inexplicably, shockingly, the absolute madness of this unforgettable El Paso saga was still not entirely over. If you thought the absolute worst that could possibly happen had already transpired within the highly confined, brightly lit walls of the massive arena, you are entirely, blissfully unaware of the chilling, highly organized, and deeply disturbing darkness that was rapidly brewing just outside the stadium doors. What exactly happens when the final, deafening chord rings out, the heavy stage lights finally go black, and the exhausted artists attempt to simply retreat to their temporary homes to rest, only to discover that the terrifying obsession of the crowd has completely followed them into the quiet, dark streets of the city? Brace yourselves, hold your breath, and prepare for a massive, highly unsettling shock to your system, because the next unbelievable chapter of our countdown plunges directly into the terrifying, highly illegal realm of organized stalking, high-speed chases, and the absolute, total invasion of private sanctuary. Number 3. The Midnight Chase, Highway Stalking, Ultimate Privacy Invasion. As the final, lingering, deafening echoes of the thunderous stadium applause tragically faded into the suffocating, intensely humid night air of El Paso, Texas, and the massive, glittering venue finally began to empty its tens of thousands of exhausted, highly emotional occupants into the surrounding dark streets, a completely different, far more sinister, and deeply organized breed of sheer madness was quietly, methodically clicking into high gear just beyond the heavy, reinforced security gates. The spectacular, high-energy concert was officially over. The blinding, multi-million-dollar stage lights were completely powered down, and for the incredibly hard-working, physically drained performers who had just poured every single ounce of their soul, sweat, and raw emotional energy into a grueling, flawless 3-hour spectacle, the only remaining desire was the simple, fundamental human need for quiet, safe, and entirely undisturbed rest. However, the deeply toxic, horrifyingly obsessed faction of the massive crowd had an entirely different, incredibly dangerous, and highly illegal agenda meticulously planned out. We are now stepping completely out of the brightly lit, heavily monitored, and relatively controlled realm of the concert arena and plunging headfirst into the terrifying, highly unpredictable, and genuinely life-threatening world of organized vehicular stalking and the absolute, total destruction of basic human privacy. As the highly secure fleet of heavy, black, heavily tinted SUVs carrying the exhausted artists and their crucial, highly stressed management team finally pulled out of the heavily guarded underground loading dock, desperately attempting to slip entirely unnoticed into the quiet, desolate Texas night, a massive, highly coordinated swarm of suspiciously parked rental cars, rogue local taxis, and unmarked personal vehicles violently roared to life, instantly swarming the official convoy like a pack of ravenous, starved predators terrifyingly locking onto their incredibly vulnerable prey. This wasn't just a handful of overly excited, innocent teenagers hoping to catch a fleeting, final, harmless glimpse of their beloved idols at a red light. This was a terrifyingly organized, highly dangerous, high-speed vehicular pursuit completely tearing through the usually quiet, unsuspecting local highways and peaceful suburban streets of El Paso. The sheer, staggering audacity and the profound, absolute disregard for fundamental public safety displayed during this horrifying midnight chase is a deeply embarrassing, permanent, and dark stain on the collective reputation of the fandom that simply cannot be ignored, heavily minimized, or swept under the rug. Imagine, for a profound, sobering moment, the sheer, paralyzing terror unfolding inside those dark, cramped, aggressively pursued official vehicles. The artists, completely stripped of their glamorous, untouchable stage personas, likely dressed in simple, comfortable sweatpants, desperately trying to ice their intensely aching muscles, hydrate their completely exhausted bodies, or simply close their heavy, burning eyes for just a few precious minutes of peace, suddenly found themselves forcefully, violently trapped in a terrifying, high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled game of cat and mouse on the dark, unforgiving El Paso asphalt. Vehicles driven by violently obsessed, completely out-of-control fans were aggressively, blindly swerving across multiple busy highway lanes, recklessly running solid, bright red traffic lights without a single second of hesitation, dangerously tailgating the heavy official SUVs at horrifyingly high speeds, and executing completely illegal, incredibly dangerous driving maneuvers that could have easily, instantly resulted in a catastrophic, highly fatal multi-car pileup, severely injuring or even tragically killing innocent El Paso citizens who were simply, quietly trying to drive home to their families from their late-night work shifts. The deeply toxic, unbelievably warped psychological justification behind this terrifying, highly criminal behavior is a massive, glowing red flag that perfectly, disturbingly highlights the absolute darkest, most horrifying depths of severe parasocial delusion within modern pop culture. These highly aggressive individuals dangerously, arrogantly convinced themselves that simply because they bought a highly expensive concert ticket or streamed a music video millions of times, they somehow magically, legally owned an exclusive, 24/7, all-access pass to the artist's entirely private, off-stage lives, completely and maliciously overriding every single fundamental law of basic human decency, legal privacy, and crucial, life-saving road safety. They genuinely, sickeningly believed that aggressively hunting down the exact, highly classified location of the artist's private, heavily guarded hotel was somehow a profound badge of ultimate honor, a twisted, highly toxic competition to loudly prove who was the most dedicated, resourceful, or hardcore fan in the entire global community. But let us immediately inject a massive, highly uncomfortable, and absolutely necessary dose of stark, freezing cold reality into this highly romanticized, incredibly dangerous delusion. Aggressively, relentlessly following a complete stranger's car through the dark, unfamiliar streets of a foreign city in the dead of night is absolutely not an act of pure love, it is not a cute, quirky display of immense, overwhelming passion, and it is most certainly not an innocent, harmless fan activity. It is the exact, literal, legal definition of criminal stalking, targeted harassment, and severe, intentional psychological abuse. The immense, unseen, and entirely undocumented psychological toll this terrifying ordeal inflicted on the deeply exhausted, highly vulnerable artists is utterly heartbreaking, profoundly disturbing, and completely unforgivable. Their basic, fundamental, God-given human right to feel entirely secure, to exist peacefully and quietly outside the blinding, exhaustive glare of the public eye, and to simply breathe without the suffocating, terrifying, and constant fear of being maliciously watched, aggressively hunted, and physically pursued, was violently, callously, and selfishly ripped away from them by the very people who loudly, hypocritically, and constantly claim to protect and love them the most. How can you possibly, genuinely sleep peacefully at night knowing that your incredibly selfish, wildly dangerous, and entirely illegal actions directly caused the very person you supposedly adore to experience severe panic, genuine, paralyzing fear, and absolute, debilitating anxiety? The horrifying, cinematic El Paso highway chase eventually, thankfully ended in a chaotic, highly tense, and intensely loud standoff at the heavily barricaded, brightly lit entrance of a luxury downtown hotel, where an absolute army of extremely stressed, visibly angry private security guards and heavily armed local El Paso police officers had to forcefully, physically intercept the aggressive, swarming civilian vehicles, hastily erecting massive, heavy emergency steel barriers just to allow the deeply traumatized, visibly shaken, and intensely quiet artists to safely sprint from the heavy, bulletproof car doors directly into the secure, heavily locked lobby like terrified, hunted fugitives escaping a highly dangerous, bloodthirsty mob. The beautiful, trusting relationship between the artists and the city, the wonderful, immensely positive, and healing energy of the 3-hour concert, was entirely, completely, and perhaps permanently overshadowed by this highly illegal, deeply embarrassing, and genuinely terrifying display of absolute, uncontrollable mob madness. We must completely, forcefully, and permanently eradicate this highly dangerous, incredibly toxic behavior from the very deep roots of our entire global community. We must loudly, aggressively ostracize, strictly condemn, and actively report anyone who actively participates in, encourages, or quietly normalizes the highly illegal, deeply traumatic physical stalking of human beings under the incredibly flimsy, absolute garbage, and highly manipulative excuse of fandom love. If you truly, genuinely, and deeply care for their mental and physical well-being, you will respect their absolute, non-negotiable right to complete privacy, you will completely ignore their private, off-schedule locations, and you will fiercely, actively protect their off-stage peace just as strongly, passionately, and loudly as you cheer for their spectacular on-stage performances. Number 2. The hotel infiltration, midnight calls, ultimate sanctuary breached. As the heavy, reinforced, brass-handled glass doors of the luxury downtown El Paso hotel finally slammed shut, securely locking out the terrifying, high-speed chaos of the midnight vehicular chase we just witnessed, a massive, collective sigh of profound, desperate relief likely washed over the completely exhausted, physically battered, and deeply traumatized performers and their incredibly stressed management team. They had miraculously, thankfully survived the grueling, 3-hour stadium spectacle under the unforgiving Texas heat, successfully navigated the terrifying, aggressive barricade breaches, dodged the highly dangerous, flying projectiles, and narrowly escaped the highly illegal, nightmare-inducing highway pursuit through the dark, unfamiliar city streets. For a fleeting, incredibly naive, and desperately hopeful fraction of a second, as they finally stepped into the quiet, beautifully air-conditioned, and softly lit luxury hotel lobby, surrounded by the towering, highly trained private security detail and the visibly shaken, heavily armed local police officers, they foolishly believed they had finally, truly reached their ultimate, untouchable sanctuary. They believed the madness was officially, completely over for the night, that they could finally strip off their sweat-soaked stage clothes, ice their incredibly sore, aching muscles, and sink their exhausted bodies into the soft, welcoming hotel beds for a few precious hours of uninterrupted, silent, and deeply necessary sleep before the next grueling international flight. However, the deeply toxic, incredibly manipulative, and wildly obsessed faction of the fandom had already, terrifyingly, anticipated this exact, desperate move, entirely transforming what was supposed to be a peaceful, heavily guarded resting place into a highly invasive, deeply psychological, and entirely terrifying trap. We are now violently crossing the absolute, non-negotiable boundary of physical safety and plunging headfirst into the deeply disturbing, highly illegal, and completely horrifying realm of organized hotel infiltration and the absolute, total destruction of fundamental domestic privacy. Unbeknownst to the exhausted artists desperately trying to find their designated room keys in the quiet lobby, a highly coordinated, terrifyingly dedicated network of stalker fans had already systematically infiltrated the very building hours, or perhaps even days, in advance. These weren't just random, overly excited people off the street. These were highly organized, deeply obsessed individuals who had strategically pooled massive amounts of money to book expensive rooms on the exact same VIP floors, utilizing fake names, highly deceptive aliases, and completely fabricated backstories just to physically plant themselves inside the designated safe zone. The sheer, staggering level of premeditation, the profound, mind-boggling financial and logistical effort dedicated solely to violently breaching a complete stranger's private space, is a terrifying testament to how deeply, dangerously warped the toxic obsession had truly become. But simply booking a room was only the physical beginning of this incredibly invasive, highly embarrassing nightmare. As the deeply exhausted artists finally, thankfully locked their individual hotel room doors, desperately praying for absolute silence and a moment to breathe, the terrifying, psychological warfare silently commenced. Suddenly, in the dead, quiet hours of the early morning, the incredibly loud, sharp, and highly jarring sound of the internal hotel room telephones violently shattered the peaceful silence. It wasn't the front desk offering late-night room service apologies, nor was it a necessary, standard wake-up call from their dedicated management team. It was the terrifying, highly disturbing sound of obsessive, breathless fans who had aggressively, illegally bribed hotel staff or deceptively sweet-talked the exhausted night shift telephone operators into illegally transferring their outside calls directly into the artists' highly confidential, private rooms. Imagine, for a profound, intensely uncomfortable moment, the sheer, paralyzing horror of being jolted awake from a deep, desperately needed sleep by the ringing phone, only to hear the heavy breathing, the frantic, uncontrollable giggling, or the aggressive, demanding voices of absolute strangers who completely, illegally know exactly where you are sleeping. The profound, terrifying realization that the heavy, solid wooden door of your hotel room is absolutely not a safe, impenetrable barrier, that the terrifying, obsessive gaze of the mob has successfully, invisibly penetrated the very walls of your temporary home, is a deeply traumatic, highly severe form of psychological abuse that can permanently, completely destroy a person's fundamental sense of basic security and mental well-being. But the absolute horror didn't magically stop at terrifying midnight phone calls. The deeply toxic, entirely boundary-less fans began quietly, deliberately roaming the softly lit, carpeted hallways of the exclusive VIP floors in the dead of night, aggressively pressing their ears directly against the heavy wooden doors of the artists' rooms, desperately, sickeningly trying to listen in on their completely private, highly intimate conversations, the running water of their showers, or simply the very sound of them breathing. Some incredibly bold, highly delusional individuals even attempted to aggressively bribe the exhausted, underpaid hotel housekeeping staff with massive, absurd amounts of cash, desperately demanding to be given the discarded, unwashed bed sheets, the used, wet bathroom towels, or even the empty, crushed water bottles left behind in the artists' rooms, completely treating these highly unsanitary, deeply personal items like sacred, holy relics to be hoarded, worshipped, and loudly flaunted on toxic, underground internet forums. This highly disturbing, completely illegal, and entirely unacceptable behavior perfectly, tragically highlights a terrifying, rapidly growing sickness within the extreme fringes of modern pop culture devotion, the complete, absolute dehumanization of the beloved artist. These terrifyingly obsessed individuals no longer see a living, breathing, deeply exhausted human being who desperately requires basic sleep, fundamental privacy, and common respect. They only see a highly coveted, beautifully packaged consumer product, an interactive, highly valuable object that exists solely, entirely to satisfy their boundless, deeply selfish, and highly toxic curiosity. They falsely, arrogantly believe that their extreme, entirely unhinged level of dedication magically grants them the absolute, unquestionable right to systematically strip away every single layer of the artist's basic human dignity and privacy. The immense, unseen collateral damage of this terrifying hotel infiltration was also profoundly, unfairly inflicted on the completely innocent, entirely oblivious regular hotel guests who had simply traveled to El Paso for quiet corporate business trips or relaxing, peaceful family vacations. These ordinary people, completely exhausted from their own travels, were suddenly, rudely awakened by the frantic, echoing sounds of heavily armed security guards desperately sprinting down the hallways, the loud, angry, volatile arguments as trespassing fans were aggressively, physically evicted from the premises, and the suffocating, highly tense atmosphere of a luxury vacation hotel that had been instantly, forcefully transformed into a highly militarized, deeply chaotic war zone. The sheer, profound embarrassment that the entire fandom should collectively feel regarding this highly illegal, deeply shameful incident is absolutely immeasurable and cannot be overstated. We must explicitly, forcefully, and permanently tear down the highly dangerous, incredibly manipulative narrative that stalking a hotel or digging for room numbers is a harmless, cute, or funny detective game. It is a highly illegal, profoundly traumatic, and deeply invasive crime that entirely destroys the mental health, the basic trust, and the fundamental human rights of the very people you loudly claim to adore and protect on social media. Number 1. The digital breach, flight leaks, total identity invasion. As the terrifying, exhausting physical nightmare of the El Paso concert, the horrific highway chase, and the deeply traumatic hotel infiltration finally, mercifully drew to a close, a completely invisible, deeply insidious, and far more permanent horror was being meticulously executed in the cold, unfeeling digital shadows of the dark web and highly toxic underground forum communities. You see, when the deeply obsessed, highly toxic stalker fans realized that the heavy physical security presence at the luxury hotel was simply too massive, too heavily armed, and entirely impossible to fully bypass for any prolonged, direct physical contact, they violently, maliciously shifted their terrifying obsession away from the tangible world and directly into the highly vulnerable, deeply personal, and fundamentally sacred digital lives of the exhausted performers. We have finally reached the absolute, undeniable, and deeply devastating pinnacle of our countdown, the most profoundly embarrassing, highly illegal, and genuinely terrifying moment of the entire El Paso saga, the complete, ruthless, and highly organized destruction of their fundamental digital privacy and the horrific, targeted harassment of their completely innocent, non-famous family members thousands of miles away. It started with a chilling, highly sophisticated breach of highly confidential, heavily protected airline databases and telecommunication networks. While the severely traumatized artists were desperately trying to salvage a few fleeting hours of sleep in their heavily guarded hotel rooms, entirely unaware of the digital storm violently brewing online, highly organized networks of malicious Saisiengs, the absolute darkest, most terrifying, and deeply criminal extreme of fandom culture, were actively, illegally purchasing the artist's highly classified, private departure flight manifests from deeply corrupt, severely compromised airline employees or highly skilled malicious hackers operating on the dark web. This wasn't just a simple, innocent rumor about what time they might arrive at the El Paso International Airport for their departure. This was the highly illegal, deeply disturbing distribution of their exact, highly sensitive government passport numbers, their specific, highly protected seat assignments on the commercial aircraft, their deeply personal dietary meal requests, and even the highly confidential, entirely unlisted personal cell phone numbers they desperately used to privately contact their terrified mothers back home. Imagine, for a profound, mind-shattering moment, the sheer, paralyzing, and completely suffocating horror of waking up the next morning, turning on your completely private, unlisted personal phone that only your absolute closest family and strict management are supposed to know, only to be instantly, violently bombarded by literally tens of thousands of terrifying, highly aggressive text messages, heavy breathing voicemails, and deeply disturbing, highly manipulative digital threats from completely anonymous, obsessive strangers. The profound, terrifying realization that your entire digital identity, the very last remaining, fragile thread connecting you to a normal, private life, has been completely, maliciously stripped away and callously sold to the highest bidder on the internet is a deeply traumatic, highly severe psychological violation that goes far, far beyond any physical injury sustained at a concert barricade. But the absolute, undeniable depths of this horrific, highly embarrassing depravity completely plunged to an entirely new, deeply sickening low when the deeply toxic obsession violently aggressively bypassed the artists entirely and maliciously targeted their completely innocent, entirely oblivious family members residing quietly back in South Korea. The highly unhinged, intensely frustrated fans who had entirely failed to physically grab the artists at the El Paso barricades or illegally breached their secure hotel rooms desperately, maliciously sought out a deeply twisted, highly toxic form of ultimate revenge and validation by ruthlessly doxing the artists' completely non-famous parents, siblings, and extended relatives online. Within mere hours of the El Paso concert concluding, highly classified, deeply private home addresses, personal phone numbers, and totally locked, private social media accounts of the artist's beloved family members were violently, publicly leaked onto massive, highly toxic global platforms. Completely innocent mothers and fathers, who simply wanted to quietly, proudly support their incredibly hard-working sons from afar without being dragged into the terrifying spotlight, were suddenly, horrifically subjected to a terrifying, highly coordinated avalanche of aggressive midnight phone calls, deeply disturbing threat messages, and highly invasive, utterly terrifying demands for the artist's exact locations. The sheer, profound, and absolute staggering lack of basic human empathy, the deeply disturbing, highly criminal mental gymnastics required to aggressively terrorize an innocent, aging parent simply because you claim to love their famous child, is a monumental, highly disgusting, an entirely unforgivable failure of basic human morality that permanently stains the entire global fandom. The artists, already completely physically exhausted, severely mentally drained, and deeply traumatized by the chaotic events of the previous 24 hours in Texas, were now violently forcefully thrust into a state of absolute, sheer panic, desperately, frantically trying to coordinate emergency private security details for their deeply terrified families thousands of miles across the globe while desperately trying to navigate the massive, highly stressful airport mob that was already violently forming at the El Paso terminal entirely based on the illegally leaked flight data. This deeply horrific, incredibly sad digital invasion fundamentally, permanently alters the core psychology and the basic worldview of the performers. A physically thrown water bottle on a stadium stage might violently leave a massive, painful bruise that agonizingly heals over a few difficult weeks, but the profound, deeply terrifying psychological scar of knowing that your very existence dangerously puts your completely innocent, highly beloved family in direct, physical danger is a heavy, suffocating, and permanent emotional burden that never, ever truly fades away. It completely destroys the absolute joy of creating art. The highly embarrassing, deeply illegal events surrounding the El Paso concert serve as the absolute, ultimate, completely undeniable wake-up call for every single consumer of modern pop culture and digital media. We have systematically, dangerously normalized a deeply toxic, highly invasive, and entirely abusive parasocial relationship dynamic where highly traumatizing criminal stalking, massive digital data breaches, and severe psychological warfare are completely, sickeningly brushed off as merely being passionate or dedicated. It is absolutely not passion, it is highly illegal, severely abusive, deeply traumatizing criminal behavior, and we absolutely must draw a massive, glowing, impenetrable red line right here and right now. As the massive, heavily guarded airplane finally, thankfully took off from the El Paso tarmac, physically carrying the deeply exhausted, completely traumatized artists away from the massive, sprawling desert city that had violently, aggressively hosted one of the absolute darkest, most profoundly embarrassing 48 hours of their entire global careers, we are all collectively left standing completely amidst the highly toxic, deeply disturbing wreckage of our own deeply flawed community behavior. If you genuinely, truly, and deeply care about these incredible artists, if you honestly respect the beautiful, world-changing music they meticulously create and the positive, healing messages they constantly spread across the world, you must absolutely, actively, and fiercely destroy this highly toxic, deeply dangerous culture of ultimate possession and digital stalking. You must loudly, aggressively report the illegal data leakers, completely ostracize the terrifying digital stalkers, and fiercely, unconditionally protect the fundamental, deeply necessary human right to absolute privacy for both the artists and their entirely innocent families. We must drastically change our behavior today, right now, before this highly toxic digital monster we have collectively created permanently destroys the very humans who originally brought us together.